Okay, we are at 165. I'll read the first paragraph and then someone else can pick it up from there. True charity, caritas, is capable of incorporating all these elements in its concern for others. In the case of personal encounters, including those involving a distant or forgotten brother or sister, it can do so by employing all the resources that the institutions of an organized, free, and creative society are capable of generating. Even the Good Samaritan, for example, needed to have a nearby inn that could provide the help that he was personally unable to offer. Love of neighbor is concrete and squanders none of the resources needed to bring about historical change that can benefit the poor and disadvantaged. At times, however, leftist ideologies or social doctrines linked to individualistic ways of acting and ineffective procedures affect only a few, while the majority of those left behind remain dependent on the goodwill of others. This demonstrates the need for a greater spirit of fraternity, but also a more efficient worldwide organization to help resolve the problems plaguing the abandoned who are suffering and dying in poor countries. It also shows that there is no one solution, no single acceptable methodology, no economic recipe that can be applied indiscriminately to all. Even the most rigorous scientific studies can propose different courses of action. You know, that's something I hadn't thought of before, that it was important that there was an inn just a little ways down the road in the story that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan.
And that the innkeeper was willing to take in someone who might, you know, or to take the money of a Samaritan.
True. Good point, Jeffrey. Yeah. Of course, it was 2 denarii. So nothing to be sneezed at there.
Pastor, who do you think that the Pope is speaking to about, because in a more efficient worldwide organization, and it's not plural. So what do you think who or what is he referring to within that one worldwide organization?
Ellen, do you have any thoughts on that?
The United Nations. No, I was asking about leftists. What does he mean there?
I would think he's going all the way to like Soviets.
Is that left?
Yeah. Remember, the Vatican never has had a good relationship with the hardline communists. But yeah, Karen, I would think he's thinking in terms of something like the United Nations, or maybe the United Nations in its finer moments. The United Nations has done some really good work, but it's also become a political football a lot of times.
He goes on to talk about the United Nations coming up.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So, who would like to start reading at 166?
I will.
I'll read. Everything then depends on our ability to see the need for a change of heart, attitudes, and lifestyles. Otherwise, political propaganda, the media, and the shapers of public opinion will continue to promote an individualistic and uncritical culture subservient to unregulated economic interests and societal institutions at the service of those who already enjoy too much power. Wow, that's a big, long sentence. My criticism of the technocratic paradigm involves more than simply thinking that if we control excesses, everything will be fine. The bigger risk does not come from specific objects, material realities, or institutions, but from the way that they are used. It has to do with human weakness, the proclivity to selfishness that is part of what the Christian tradition refers to as conspicuous sense.
Concupiscence.
Okay, fine. I don't know that word. The human inclination to be concerned only with myself, my group, my own petty interests.
Concupiscence
is not a flaw limited to our own day. It has been present from the beginning of humanity and has simply changed and taken on different forms down the ages, using whatever means each moment of history can provide. That word, however, can be overcome with the help of God.
Okay, concupiscence is a word we should all learn. It's a word that's often used in theological and political discussions. Concupiscence.
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 It means a kind of radical self-interest.
Radical self-interest. Okay. Notes.
And it's, as I said, it's used often in theological discussions and political discussions. It's really just huge selfishness. But it's a selfishness that's manifested in terms of spiritual dimensions and psychological dimensions, and of course, in practical ways as well.
Okay then.
But it seems to me that that's the human condition.
Well, what did Luther say was the definition of sin?
Turning in on oneself.
To be curved in on the self. Exactly. Yeah. So there you go.
There you go.
I see what I'm thinking about is that, and so that's why, you know, in our government, or at least the formation of the government, they tried for checks and balances, and he, you know, the Pope talks about the bigger risk does not come from specific objects, material realities, or institutions. The only trouble is that you don't want just one of those. Is that it's the competition, the comparison that kind of keeps them both honest. Helps to keep them both honest.
Yeah. It's a shame they have to be in competition.
I argue that though, if you have a monopoly, then concupiscence shows up.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Shall I continue on 167 and then give somebody else 168? Okay. Education and upbringing, concern for others, a well-integrated view of life and spiritual growth. All these are essential for quality human relationships and for enabling society itself to react against injustices, aberrations, and abuses of economic, technological, political, and media power. Some liberal approaches ignore this factor of human weakness. They envisage a world that follows a determined order and is capable by itself of ensuring a bright future and providing solutions for every problem.
Sounds like a liberal to me.
Boy, howdy.
On the other hand, some conservative approaches are so incredibly cynical and pessimistic that they won't allow for a reasonable discussion of some of the more optimistic approaches.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
So we end up stalemated.
Isn't that also called the balance of power?
Except we end up in this seesaw where it keeps going back and forth instead of,
Brady.
Okay. I read a really interesting...
I guess I would argue that in that seesawing, there is some advancement.
I think you're right, Bob. I think there is. It's just unfortunate that it has to fight so hard for the advancement to happen.
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, that also goes back to our conversations of, are we all on the same page about where we're going, what we want, what direction is best? Everybody has their own ideas of what direction that is. So they're all fighting for those things. So they naturally will be in competition because they're different. Right. But the interesting thing is, you know, as we've been reading, is that it's so important to hear all of the different voices, whether they're in competition or not. Or at least that's what I understood of previous, much closer to the top, much closer to the beginning of this, of Fratelli Tutti, is the importance of listening to all of those different kinds of voices.
Yeah. And I think it's important too to understand the worldview of the people you're working with or in dialogue with. You know, one of the things we've been learning in the Gospel of Mark class is that those ancient people had that limited good worldview. And a whole lot of people in the world today still have that worldview. There's only so much to go around. So we have to, you know, you can't, you have to be aware of what your limited resources are. And there's some truth to that. Resources are not limitless, but at the same time, they're not quite as limited as some people make them out to be. And I think sometimes people start drawing in the wagon, circling the wagons a lot earlier than necessary. This is where more conversation is needed. Anyway.
I can read.
We're going to get into Adam Smith here.
I'll go ahead and read. The marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem. However much we are asked to believe this dogma of neoliberal faith. Whatever the challenge, this impoverished and repetitive school of thought always offers the same recipes. Neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magic theories of spillover or trickle without using the name as the only solution to societal problems. There is little appreciation of the fact that the alleged spillover does not resolve the inequality that gives rise to new forms of violence threatening the fabric of society. It is imperative to have a proactive economic policy directed at promoting an economy that favors productive diversity and business creativity, and makes it possible for jobs to be created and not cut. Financial speculation fundamentally aimed at quick profit continues to wreak havoc. Indeed, without internal forms of solidarity and mutual trust, the market cannot completely fulfill its proper economic function. And today, this trust has ceased to exist. The story did not end the way it was meant to, and the dogmatic formulae prevailing economic theory proved not to be infallible. The fragility of world systems in the face of the pandemic has demonstrated that not everything can be resolved by market freedom. It has also shown that In addition to recovering a sound political life that is not subject to the dictates of finance, we must put human dignity back at the center, and on that pillar, build the alternative social structures we need.
This is where language gets really fascinating to me, because the whole idea of trickle down being classified as a neoliberal idea, when it was put forth by neoconservatives, well, you know, it gets confusing, but it was in fact a neoliberal idea economically, in neoliberal economics. And in its own funny way, it was kind of an optimistic idea that if you let the rich people have more money, they would be generous with it and it would spill down and everybody would be happy. And at that point, it was the, quote, liberals who were being pessimistic and saying, that ain't going to be what happens. That's not how it's going to be work, which is why we need to continue to have more regulations. The government needs to be more regulatory here. The taxes need to be higher because people are greedy. So in that instance, the liberal people were being more pessimistic and more conservative, and things got kind of topsy-turvy. Here we are 20, 30 years later, and it's proven to be that we did need more regulation. We did need higher taxes. We still do, because the money doesn't trickle down. And that's been demonstrated, I think, to everybody's satisfaction. And yet, the same old experiment keeps getting tried and it keeps not working. Anyway, other thoughts?
I was going to say that in this particular paragraph, this 168, it strikes me, I think that it ties back to something we read last Wednesday, having to do with the government, having to do with the basic economic structure of a society moving so quickly that it leaves people behind. And what came to mind for me was just the advancement of technology and how automation is becoming more and more prevalent in taking away some of the, I wouldn't call them the front line, taking away the jobs of what I would call essential workers, only because people in that in the essential worker category seem to fit this situation where automation is taking away the jobs that don't require a lot of technological know-how. And so our society and our market-based economics is moving towards more automation, more technology, more artificial intelligence, and we're leaving a lot of people behind without the ability to enter into the labor force with little or no skills. And I think that it's probably the government's responsibility to move into that role to help uplift those people that are, in order to, how can I say this, to help educate, to help structure areas of society where those people can also find work and not be left behind.
Well, yeah, who else would do it?
Who else can do it?
Who else would have the resources? Right. Because of the size of the problem.
Or the will, Pastor, or the will to take it on. I don't think in a totally free market, which emphasizes competitiveness and gain over others, that by and large, most companies are in their self-interest. I think particularly if they are publicly traded, they're subject to scrutiny by their shareholders as to profitability. Yeah, so the government is the only place where, yeah. That's it. That's all I got.
Yep. Well, and I wonder sometimes if we end up, many people end up with this idea that the government is an adversary because they forget that the government is us. It is us collectively. This is why I think our language of, by, and for the people is so important. And we need to keep bringing that to the fore and reminding ourselves that this is us. It's what we do collectively. And we need to make sure that we are the ones who keep our hand in and don't let it become some kind of other thing. But at the same time, we need to keep reminding ourselves that it is not some thing to which we are opposed or that it is in opposition to us. It is us. And that it is composed of us. And it governs at our sufferance and by our will. I mean, we might not always like the people that get elected, but we are the ones doing the electing. And we entrust them to work on our behalf and in our best interest. And if we don't like what they're doing and how they're doing it, we vote them out. And in the meantime, we write letters and we make phone calls and we send emails and we do whatever we can to let them know what our desires and wishes are. Especially when it comes to how they are using our collective assets to our betterment or detriment. And we get together in small groups and grumble a lot. So.
The right and the privilege.
What? You're kind of off mic, Ellen.
That's a good thing.
Okay. $169.
Okay, in some closed and monochrome economic approaches, for example, there seems to be no place for popular movements that unite the unemployed, temporary and informal workers, and many others who do not easily find a place in existing structures. Yet those movements manage various forms of popular economy and of community production. What is needed is a model of social, political, and economic participation that can include popular movements and invigorate local, national, and international governing structures that the torrent of moral energy that springs from, including the excluded, in the building of a common destiny, while also ensuring that these experiences of solidarity, which grow up from below, from the subsoil of the planet, can come together, be more coordinated, keep on meeting one another. This, however, must happen in a way that will not betray their distinctive way of acting as sowers of change, promoters of a process involving millions of actions, great and small, creatively intertwined like words in a poem. In that sense, such movements are social poets that, in their own way, work, propose, promote, and liberate. They help make possible an integral human development that goes beyond the idea of social policies being a policy for the poor, but never with the poor and never of the poor, much less part of a project that reunites peoples. They may be troublesome, and certain theorists may find it hard to classify them, yet we must find the courage to acknowledge that without them, democracy atrophies, turns into a mere word, a formality. It loses its representative character and becomes disembodied, since it leaves out the people in their daily struggle for dignity, in the building of their future. Any idea what these popular movements are?
This whole thing.
I don't know about that, but I was focused on the inclusionary aspect of this paragraph, rather than, you know, the doing something for the poor. And it strikes me that, you know, we're talking about that all must prosper.
Yeah.
Moral energy. I got lost in this paragraph. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that kind of the same thing,
well,
Ellen.
I get a little lost with the kind of the artistic reference, you know, like the social poets. That gets a little too flowery for me.
I just wish I knew what he meant.
I get lost in the that paragraph that starts. I mean, the sentence that starts. They help make possible an integral human development, and then in quotes, the idea of social policies being a policy for the poor, but never with the poor or never of the poor. I'm losing his thoughts there. I don't understand that. Maybe someone could help me out.
Well, go ahead.
No, I'm not sure. It's like what Liz said, that what is a popular movement that unites unemployed temporary and informal workers in some kind of other structure, right? I'm totally lost by that. I'm sorry. I know, yeah, I like Liz. I just wonder what he's talking about. What kind of movements is that?
Okay. Well, you know, he starts out talking about monochrome economic approaches.
Yeah.
I think, you know, people coming at economic problems with a single philosophical idea and trying to make everything fit that philosophical idea. And then when he talks about incorporating the poor into the solutions for their problems, the one that comes to mind that was reasonably successful, and it turned into both an economic and a political movement that brought real change, was the Solidarity movement in Poland. That was a very inclusive movement. It started as a political protest, but it had serious economic overtones, and it brought in people from all directions and ended up, you know, becoming a government. in Poland. Another one that comes to mind is Angela Merkel. Her ability to bring in voices from all directions and form a kind of cohesive economic policy for Germany. I mean, she came out of East Germany and very much sold on a more capitalistic approach, but at the same time, not forgetting some of the lessons learned in the previous system that had been East Germany. I mean, she was in favor of synthesis and used it. And always made sure she listened to the people. I was reading this morning about, you know, she has given up her office. And I read this morning that the people of Germany came out and stood on the balconies of their apartments and outside their houses and applauded her for 6 minutes yesterday.
Wow.
Because of the way she conducted things. She incorporated everybody. She listened to all the voices and didn't just kind of plow ahead with her singular vision.
Do you think, excuse me, do you think Cesar Chavez and his movement in California for the rights of the farm workers could also fit into this definition of what he's talking about?
It's an interesting example. I don't know. What do you guys think? I don't.
I feel like I'm very ill prepared for the things that he's talking about, because I'm even in stuff that I've learned in school, I can't even I can't come up with one single popular movement that could be that I know of. So
I'm looking at the footnotes, and maybe there's something on the web that talks about, because this is from the address to participants in the World Meeting of Popular Movements. And so there must have been some discussion about some of these popular movements in that address. And so maybe stepping back and looking at that particular notes from that meeting might help us have a better understanding of what the Pope means by all of this.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, what Phil said there, is he talking about perhaps unions, or an example as unions? That's what Phil was saying, I think.
Well, certainly I could classify it as a popular movement. It was a protest movement against taking advantage of the farm workers in California, not giving them their due for the work that they do. It eventually became a union. It kind of morphed, as I understand, it kind of morphed into that, but it certainly was started off as a popular movement, kind of I'm not sure I could call it an alternative way of getting justice, but I guess it would be considered somewhat that way.
Yeah, I think you've got a point there, Phil. It could very well be. And yeah, that's a good example.
And I'm wondering about Habitat for Humanity. Here's a project that involves people, from all walks of life to build and refurbish these houses. But at the same time, they require that the people that are going to occupy these houses participate. And so It's a policy that involves them.
That's a really good example, Bob. I hadn't thought about that.
But
I help but think about, natural disasters or disasters that have happened in various parts of the world. And it feels as though with those occurrences, people oftentimes come together, create, build, do things that, otherwise they don't identify the need, but people come together to do amazing things when there's a disaster. Amazing things.
Katrina was a really good example of that, Karen. Yeah, people put aside all kinds of political differences and just came together to help rebuild. Yeah. Shall we go ahead?
Well, let me read 170. International power. I would once more observe that the financial crisis of 2007-2008 provided an opportunity to develop a new economy, more attentive to ethical principles and new ways of regulating speculative financial practices and virtual health. But the response to the crisis did not include rethinking the outdated criteria which continue to rule the world. Indeed, it appears that the actual strategies developed worldwide in the wake of the crisis fostered greater individualism, less integration, and increased freedom for the truly powerful, who always find a way to escape unscathed. Okay, I'm really lost in this one.
Which financial crisis is that? Was there a worldwide financial crisis in 2007, 2008?
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
It was big time.
Yeah, the banking crisis, when so many people were losing their homes, banks were foreclosed.
Right, worldwide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, the one where Mary and I lost $250,000 in equity overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah.
But who's counting?
Yeah. The thing that just really took my cheese on that whole business is that the program they came up with gave tons of money to the financial institutions. And it, in my opinion, great economist that I am.
You populist, you.
In my opinion, they should have given the money to the people who
Absolutely.
And said, okay, here's the money, pay off your mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
That way the financial institutions will get their money, but you won't be left on the hook for it. They made the mistakes. They're the ones who created the crisis. And we can't let them sink.
Let's bail them out.
Right, but let's not leave all the homeowners on the hook for it.
Exactly.
So if they had given the money to the homeowners, but with the instructions that it has to be used to pay off the loans, it would have served everybody.
Just paid off the loans rather than giving the money to the banks to do as they chose.
Yeah, I think it would have been better to funnel it through the homeowners, though. It's a responsibility thing. And anyway.
I think it was easier for them to give the money to the banks than it was to parse through all of those mortgages and ascertain how much money to give to each mortgage holder in order to pay off their mortgage.
Yeah,
I think the expediency made that decision.
And the power of the banks.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because I'm too ignorant to know that. Is that what the banks did with that money, was to forgive people's mortgages?
Nope.
I don't remember that.
Nope, they did not.
That's why I wondered what exactly was the purpose of bailing out the financial institutions who caused the problem in the first place.
To keep the economy from collapsing.
Yeah.
How about make a
And to make sure
government
that,
bank?
and to make sure that the top executives at each of those banks received their annual bonuses and rewards for all the great things they did, which is where a lot of the money went.
Yep.
I still think that the for profit, I don't know. It's like I still like the idea of federal or state banks where the people are using their own money, and there's not this, you know, like you just said, Karen, there aren't CEOs at the top who have to make multi-million-dollar bonuses every year. You know, it shouldn't be for profit if it's going to really help people. And that means for savings too, you know, just it's ridiculous. There's no incentive in this country to save when you make, you know, 0.01% interest. It's just bad system.
That's why it all should be in Bailey's building in Lowen.
Yes, it should.
All right. Next.
Oh, I would also insist that follow the bouncing ball.
All right.
I would also, that's okay, I'm just joking. I would also insist that to give each his own, to cite the classic definition of justice, means that no human individual or group can consider itself absolute, entitled to bypass the dignity and the rights of other individuals or their social groupings. The effective distribution of power, especially political, economic, defense-related, and technological power among a plurality of subjects, and the creation of a juridical that word system for regulating claims and interests are one concrete way of limiting power. Yet today's world represents us with many false rights and, at the same time, broad sectors which are vulnerable, victims of power badly exercised.
Yeah.
Phrase, power badly exercised.
I hope he gets to why he thinks that occurs.
Yeah, I'm with you, Bob.
What did you say that again, Bob?
I hope that he gets to why he thinks this occurs. Why these broad sectors are vulnerable, and why are the victims of, why is power badly exercised?
Old greed.
I would suspect as well, but that's not the solution.
Well, I think the next paragraph he's going to start saying that.
I'll let somebody else read.
The 21st century is witnessing a weakening of the power of nation states, chiefly because the economic and financial sectors, being transnational, tend to prevail over the political. Given this situation, it's essential to devise stronger and more efficiently organized international institutions with functionaries who are appointed fairly by agreement among national governments and empowered to impose sanctions. When we talk about the possibility of some form of world authority regulated by law, we need not necessarily think of a personal authority. Still, such an authority ought at least to promote more effective world organizations equipped with the power to provide for the global common good, the elimination of hunger and poverty, and the sure defense of fundamental human rights. Wow. So what's needed is some kind of international institution that can oversee the international problems of hunger and poverty and human rights, that can control international abuses of financial institutions, and has the authority to do that, in which all nations participate.
Yeah, good luck.
But in which no nation gives up its sovereignty. Well, that was the original dream of the United Nations.
Yeah. It seems to me that sometimes it's the kind of power that the United States sometimes tends to assume. And I'm not sure if that's based more on arrogance than it is on effectiveness.
I think sometimes the United States has assumed that power because no one else will step up and do it.
Except they are now.
I would point out that one of the areas where this comes to the fro is that there is an effort going on in the international community to figure out how to tax internet sales. And you know, nobody's got it figured out, and I don't have to tell you that the internet people are really worried about it.
That makes sense.
Tax? You mean tax internet sales with a global tax?
Well, the problem, well, perhaps that might be an answer, but what's going on, of course, is that each country is creating their own taxation, and it's already had come to light to some extent on their taxation of international organizations, because some countries tax organizations on all their sales, regardless of where they occur, and other countries just tax them on the sales that occur within the country. And then, of course, the internet comes along and really makes that a mess.
California taxes on sales within the state, doesn't it, Bob?
I think so.
Yeah.
But that's just one place to begin. I mean, the other place that it's shown up, of course, is in the EU has been trying for decades to figure out how to create, you know, more authority for the EU, and it's not having much luck.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got to say, I'm amazed at how they've been able to kind of keep Greece afloat. And back in 2007 and 8, when all those economies were tanking, and you know, they were trying to keep things going. I mean, to do that without you know, some sort of, you know, hammer, just seems incredible.
Truly. That's part of what fueled Brexit.
What does that giving, supporting Greece in Greece's economy because it was tanking?
Yeah, that was, yeah, a lot of people in Britain weren't happy about seeing their taxes going to support Greece. And of course, now that they're living with the reality of Brexit, a lot of them aren't happy about that either. So
it's hard to be happy.
In this regard, I would also note the need for a reform of the United Nations organization and likewise of economic institutions and international finance so that the concept of the family of nations can acquire real teeth. Needless to say, this calls for clear legal limits to avoid power being co-opted only by a few countries and to prevent cultural impositions or a restriction of the basic freedoms of weaker nations on the basis of ideological differences. For the international community is a juridical community founded on the sovereignty of each member state, without bounds of subordination that deny or limit its independence. At the same time, the work of the United Nations, according to the principles set forth in the preamble and the first articles of its founding charter, can be seen as the development and promotion of the rule of law, based on the realization that justice is an essential condition for achieving the ideal of universal fraternity. There is a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law and tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration as proposed by the Charter of the United Nations, which constitutes truly a fundamental juridical norm. There is need to prevent this organization from being delegitimized, since its problems and shortcomings are capable of being jointly addressed and resolved.
Human rights.
So he's saying that the way to make this work is to create limits. So I'm sure he's going to describe. I hope he'll probably describe the limits as we go on.
I don't know if it's the limits so much, Bob, as just being very clear as to. Yeah, I guess it matches with what you've said too. The limitations have to be spelled out. Kind of the guardrails have to be put in place as to what can be legitimately covered by the United Nations.
Well, I mean, this is based on the premise that there's a initially agreed upon universal Bill of Rights, you know, universal human rights and universal rights of the child. For example, I know United Nations did that if those principles are universally accepted, then that becomes the law that the United Nations is capable of enforcing, as it were. But not to have the individual, you know, policies or thoughts of individual countries take precedence over that, if there's a basis that's agreed upon.
Yeah.
So I wonder what the role of the Security Council is.
You mean besides thwarting each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea. I truly love the idea. I'm so mindful of all the ways that so far in history, this has not played out well. I think too of the World Court, where it's such a good idea, but then you have a country like the United States on whom such an idea really depends, a very big, powerful country that says, yes, this is a good idea. We need We need a world court to hold countries accountable for human rights abuses. But you're not going to be able to try us for anything. We won't allow ourselves to be tried. I mean, it's like, well, come on, what's the point then?
That's our arrogance. Same with arms, with nuclear arms. Nobody else can have them, but we get to have ours.
Yeah, we'll have these international laws and they will apply to everybody, but we're an exception.
Mm-hmm. Always. That's what I meant by arrogance.
Well, yeah, it's kind of frustrating because, well, anyway. Courage and generosity are needed in order freely to establish shared goals and to ensure the worldwide observance of certain essential norms. For this to be truly useful, it is essential to uphold the need to be faithful to agreements undertaken, pacta sunt servanda, and to avoid the temptation to appeal to law of force rather than the force of law. What a great phrase. This means reinforcing the normative instruments for the peaceful resolution of controversies so as to strengthen their scope and binding force. Among these normative instruments, preference should be given to multilateral agreements between states because more than bilateral agreements, they guarantee the promotion of a truly universal common good and the protection of weaker states. And we are at 11 o'clock. Closing thoughts?